7:15. Should we start on time and set a precedent? Can you hear me, Macy? Okay. We have new batteries and everything. Okay. Well, once again, I want to thank you very much. This means a lot to me. I give you the news that Moby Dick just came in 45th in the list of the 100 best American novels. I say we pick our best novels the way we pick our presidents. Yeah, it's really kind of sad, the exploitation and so much else. And I noticed in the newspaper today, went through it, and there's lots of stories about things like quilting bees and the like. But we really don't pay any attention to what is important in our culture, or one of the things that's important in our culture. You know, America, maybe I've said this before, I've said it so often, we're almost unique, almost. I can't think of another country that does it, or that has had the same experience. Maybe Israel, so I'll leave that as a qualifier. Where a nation was formed, or a nation state was formed, and then sought to find its identity, to find out what it was all about. And that's unique in our history. And it took a long time, it took almost half a century for us to realize what our national literature should be. First of all, there was a question as to whether we should even think in terms of a national literature. After all, we thought, spoke, wrote in English. So we belong to the tradition of Shakespeare and Milton and Cowper and so forth and so forth. What was the point in trying to create a national literature? And besides, against these giants, we were dwarfs at best. Moreover, England had a storied history. We had trees and rocks and a wilderness and what we thought of as savages, which enabled us to kill them and take their lands, of course. And so it took a long time even to discuss what a national literature should look like. And this did not really emerge until the 1820s. Slowly, half-consciously. And it's a battle that really wasn't won until the period between the wars. And unfortunately, we pay very little attention to that in our academic hurdles, very little at all. And that's quite sad. It's one of the things that I worry about in American higher education, which you know, is rushing to the bottom in so many ways. So this is a great chance for me to talk about a book I love, that for me is the greatest work that any American has produced. And especially so because, Steve, because it's a book that is so clearly misunderstood. It's misunderstood in the academy, it's misunderstood by popular culture. As I said at the start of these talks, you know, Ahab is always represented as evil incarnate. He's a bad guy. And if you pay attention only to popular culture, you think that this was a storybook, an adventure story about a madman who kills all of his crew out of heedlessness, that he has lost. It's like some Nazi who has lost any sense of compassion for his fellow human beings. And that is simply not true. And I want to emphasize that again tonight, try to make the case even a little stronger. I also want to warn you or tell you, and this is going to sound like a boast, and it really isn't meant to be, that my view of Moby Dick is almost unique. That is, it's unique except that in some ways it does share certain observations with what other scholar critics have said. But by and large, my reading of the whole thing is not something that you will find in any academic publication, at least none that I've read, and I read a lot of them, up until about maybe 10 years ago when I finally got so sick of all this nonsense, I gave up and thought, you know, Melville deserves to be Melville and not to be used as a convenient vehicle for whatever someone's private views were about American imperialism or homosexuality or God knows what else, environmental concerns and so forth. It's sort of a sign of what has happened to the American college and university. Do you know that in every state but one, the highest paid public official, that is the man who makes the most money out of public revenues, is either a basketball or a football coach? Tells you something, doesn't it? At any rate, enough of that editorializing. Let's get back into the book, okay? And as I said, I want to emphasize now the different side of Ahab. I'm not saying that Melville holds him up as a model to emulate. He doesn't. But essentially, Ahab is a champion. He is a champion of humanity. A champion of humanity who, ironically, loses his humanity in his quest and insistence upon justice. And this is really all through the book. And if you read the book carefully, which unfortunately our critics haven't, they don't pick up on that. But it's not some, crazy theory that I have based on one line. He's an important figure. One of the things I've stressed, I hope I've stressed as we went along, is the complementarity of characters that Melville is playing with. Melville does not believe in absolutes, that there are no absolutes in reality, that absolutes are created by the human mind, by our language. But every attempt to nail something down, to pin it down, to remove it from doubt, from all doubt, is destined to fail by its very nature. That's not my thought, that's Melville's thought. And so one of the things you see throughout the book is that he will say something and then not so much undermine it, not that he's denying it, but he will bring something up counter in a corresponding passage in either the next chapter or some future chapter. Maybe a good place to start would be with Stubbs and Stubbs' dream. I don't know if any of you have reread the book recently, but you will remember I think you'll remember what it is. Stubbs has a very strange dream in which, he kicks this creature, and this creature turns out to have marlin spikes sticking out of his rear end and everywhere else. And of course, the danger of that is you kick and you get stabbed. So in your revolt, you wind up hurting yourself. And in this dream, Ahab also appears. He appears as a pyramid. And he starts kicking the pyramid. And the humpback, as he's called, tells him that is a futile gesture. Now, at the time that you read about that dream, it's not explained. It's rather mysterious. It seems clearly a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to Ahab. But precisely how it works, why Ahab is a pyramid, for example, other than perhaps he's immovable, he's stubborn, or whatever, is not at all explained. But you do get to it later on. I don't know if anybody has a book here. Now I've got so many things marked here that I'm going to have trouble finding it. Oh gosh, that's why I never took notes. I mean, I'm a disorganized person. Even when I write books, I feel it's necessary preparation. I take lots of notes, and then I don't use a single one, or I spend a month looking for the essential quote that I should have written down, or I wrote it down and it went somewhere. So give me a moment here so that I can go through my file here. Here we go. All right. And this is in chapter 35, the masthead. And I'll have to put my glasses on for that, and another encumbrance of old age. You lose life is a process of subtraction after a certain point. It's addition up until a certain point, and then there's a stasis, and then it becomes subtraction. I won't tell you what's subtracted. you can all figure out yourself. You know, he talks about, and this seems to be sort of casual talk, but it really isn't. He talks about their progenitors, the builders of Babel, most doubtless by their tower, have intended to tear the loftiest mastheads in all Asia or Africa either, yet, ere the final truck was put to it, as that great stone mast of theirs may be said to have gone by the board, in the dread gale of God's wrath. And these are recurring images and terms you'll notice here, and the reference to Babel, the confusion, the biblical allusion. All this has its counterpart. And as to the tower, the masthead, remember that Ahab will be referred to with just those words, that he is an extra masthead, that he is like a masthead, and so forth. So all this belongs to one fabric. We cannot give these Babel builders priority over the Egyptians. The Egyptians were a nation of masthead standers. You know, and that also puts us in mind of Ahab and the way he's described. In an assertion based upon the general belief among archaeologists that the first pyramids were founded for astronomical purposes. Well, maybe that's a fact, maybe not. Maybe that's something that Melville is bending to his use. Astronomical purposes. A theory singularly supported by the peculiar stair-like formation of all four sides of their edifices, whereby, with prodigious long upliftings of their legs, those old astronomers will want to mount to the apex, sing out for new stars. You see the parallel now to Ahab. Sing out for new stars. Even in the lookouts of a modern ship, sing out for a sail or a whale just bearing in sight. Saint Silas, who built, in a hermit of old times, who built him a lofty stone pillar in the desert and spent the whole latter portion of his life on its summit. That theme of isolation, of dividing yourself from humanity, of being alone, and thereby running the risk, not the risk, but stepping into the certitude of losing what makes you human. Because one of the things that Melville insists upon over and over again is that what makes us human is our participation in society. And that also has, as I said last time, I think, that also has a disadvantage. Society itself is kind of crazy. Society is ruled by people. It has a hierarchy. Without a hierarchy, there's no society. But the rulers of society, as Melville observes, are often bent from a wise course of action by their arrogance, by just drunkenness and power, by the flaws that are within every individual. So what do? Can we abolish society? Of course not. We have to learn to live with it and to find the proper mean of balance, to find our road between anarchy and dictatorship. And that's a theme that if you read the book again, next time, I hope this is the next time that you'll read the book, that you'll be alert to, the danger of isolation. And it's one of the things that is stressed in that middle part, which has to do with the society on board the Pequod. That's not just idle talk about different people's jobs. That's an important aspect of the novel, showing the interaction among human beings and how we are all dependent upon one another. If you'll recall the reference to the line on the Pequod, and Melville invents a special case for it, that on the Pequod that each man is tied to another man. That increases his awareness of his responsibilities. But of course, if those responsibilities are not met, are not enacted upon properly, then it is fatal for the fellow who is joined to you. In the chapter on the monkey rope, he again stresses that same point, how we're all tied together, and that the ship itself, the crew, has a stake in each other, that it is a different kind of thing. He also says in the book that the crew was an aggregation of islanders, of isolatos, that even though at a certain level they get along very well, they understand each other's needs, they meet those needs, that deep down, radically, that each man is isolated. And that is something, in Melville's terms, to be avoided, to be worried about, because in that isolation, we lose our humanity. We use the very things that we prize the most. Remember Father Mapple's sermon, alone. He identifies Ahab as an isolato. Even before Ahab enters into the book, he is described that way. And if you give me a moment, I'll find the place where I have it. It's in chapter 16. This works pretty well. Now, like if I can find where on this page, because I don't mark up books. Well, let's hope this is where it is. So that there are instances among them of men who he's talking about Nantucketers. And he says that a lot of men in Nantucket bear biblical names. And he mentions that this has an influence on them, that they come to resemble, they come to fulfill and fill out that destiny which their names have given them. And this, of course, is important in terms of our meeting Ahab and his story in the Bible. A singularly common fashion on the island, that is, they have scriptural names, and in childhood naturally imbibing the stately dramatic thee and thou of the Quaker idiom. Still, from the audacious, daring, and boundless adventure of their subsequent lives, strangely blend with these unoutgrown peculiarities. 1,000 bold dashes of character, not unworthy a Scandinavian sea king or a pagan Roman. And when these things unite in a man of greatly superior natural force, and we soon understand that he's preparing us to meet Ahab. A greatly superior, and this is something that's also repeated repeatedly during the course of the novel. Greatly superior natural force with a globular brain and a ponderous heart, who has also by the stillness and seclusion of many long night watches in the remotest waters, and beneath constellations never seen here at the north, been led to think untraditionally and independently, like Ahab, receiving all nature's sweet or savage impressions fresh from her own virgin and voluntary and confiding breast, again, quite characteristic of Ahab, and thereby chiefly, but with some help from accidental advantages, to learn a bold and nervous, lofty language that makes man one in a whole nation's census, a mighty pageant creature, formed for noble tragedies, nor will it detract from him, dramatically regarded, if either by birth or other circumstances he have what seems a half-willful, overruling morbidness at the bottom of his nature. For all men, tragically great, and that's certainly, Ahab, tragically great, are made so through a certain morbidness. Be sure of this, O young ambition. This is Ishmael talking to himself in a way. And you could also say that this is Melville, at age, 31, talking to himself. Remember, I think I mentioned last time, call me Ishmael? Yes. Most commentators agree that this is a note of informality, of democracy. I'm your buddy, call me Ish, But it also, of course, points back to Ishmael in the Bible, who was an orphan, rejected by his father. And that theme of orphanhood is central So that, but it's also, this Call Me Ishmael, a reference to Melville himself, because Ishmael really speaks with his voice. If you want to hear Melville's voice in this novel, you listen to Ishmael, because he sees what Melville sees. And the resolution of this irresolvable conflict is finally left in the hands, or finally placed with Ishmael. Let me finish this. Be sure of this, O young ambition. All mortal greatness is but disease. But as yet we have not to do so with such an one. You know, we haven't met this guy yet. He's practically putting his finger on Melville. But with quite another and still a man, and he's talking now about he's going to switch to Bildad. But he has used this as an occasion to foreshadow the introduction of Ahab. And as I say, it occurs again and again in the novel. In the chapter of the ship, I found that after I mentioned this last time, when I spoke of Ahab himself being an orphan, I said I didn't remember which chapter it was in, but it's in the ship that Ahab is identified as an orphan, and therefore also, of course, an isolato. Excuse me, I have to take a drink of water. Okay. So we get back to Stubbs' dream. Oh, my Lord, we went a long way off from it. So Stubb kicks against these marlin spikes and injures himself. He sees the pyramids representing Ahab. And it's not until later that Ahab is specifically identified as being pyramid-like. And that in his stand at the masthead, that he is like someone standing at the apex of a pyramid, looking into the stars, looking into the sky, and searching for stars. Again, Ahab is always looking for answers to his unanswered questions. And that question fundamentally has to do with justice. That is his monomania. And he allows that, let me go back, that question of justice is intricately tied to this theme of orphanhood. In Melville's own life, remember, that he is left an orphan by the death and bankruptcy, that his father invested unwisely, extravagantly in this boom period of the 1820s, leaving his family destitute, so that Herman Melville goes from being a rather wealthy son of an established family to someone who has to take on rather menial and poorly paid jobs just to survive. And it's a problem he never quite solved during his own lifetime. And he was very conscious, particularly in the autobiographical Redburn, of the privileges that come with class. And even though he is impoverished, he being the substitute self of Willingboro Redburn, even though he is impoverished because he has the markings of class, he is invited to eat with the captain. He's invited to enjoy the captain's library. And he feels very guilty about this and wants to refuse it because he feels powerfully this impulse towards democracy, to want to be with the men. In talking about Melville, he says, understanding the nature of society, that he had to, in order to be an effective captain, in order to hold this ship together, and this is also a theme that we find in the previous novels, that he has to adopt certain customs in which he exercises the privilege of a captain. But despite that, these are only surface obeisances to custom. That deep down, he does not feel comfortable with that he is basically affirming that he is like with one of the men. He knows he is a superior intellect, but he has great trouble with the idea of hierarchy. It's one of his quarrels with God. It's as though God represents the Father. God is dead. God has left us. How dare God do what he's done to us? Or, if it's not God, then something has taken God. Something has made the world unfair. Melville's own word, unfair. And even though, again, Melville speaking, even though there's a certain degree of unfairness which is unavoidable, the tendency in society is to accentuate and enlarge that element of unfairness. And this, and here we point to the inner character of Ahab, is something that he will not willingly accept. He does not feel comfortable with the idea of hierarchy, and most of all, with that hierarchy in which God, or whatever is in place of God that is not there, has failed his creation. Ahab wants to feel his humanities. And this is something that Ishmael reports, that Ahab was early sentence in the novel, had his humanities, that when a spring breeze comes, he thinks of those sweet young women, native women, young women dancing before him, and he smiles. He doesn't break into a laugh, but he does smile, to a certain, even this old man, like me, appreciates and lets his fantasies, human fantasies, he indulges them for that moment to enjoy that. That he is above all, he is conscious of his humanity. And it's in the pursuit of what he feels are the just deserts of that humanity, that is to know the will of God, the rule by which God would preside over us, but does not tell us that he fights. The character, the character whom Ahab most closely identifies with, and here again we find Melville's use of opposites, is Pip, the poor little Alabama boy. How much lower on the scale of society can you be than to be a rather vulnerable, completely vulnerable black child from Alabama? And he points particularly to that section, in which Pip, and I've mentioned this before so I won't dwell on it, Pip is told that when in this situation, this is how you behave. And when he behaves that way, he's chastised for it. And he's then told, well, in most cases, that's what you do. But sometimes you've got to do the opposite. Well, how is he to know? He has no experience. And yet he's chastised for for following the directions that he has been given by the mate whom he's supposed to obey, right? And then to top it off, he is told, next time this happens, we're going to let you drown because a whale is worth more than you are. That's a pretty strong indictment of our humanity. But remember, too, that when a few pages of, actually a number of chapters further on, that when the Pequod meets the Samuel Enderby, and the Enderby wants to hire the Pequod to help search for the son of the captain, Ahab refuses. That here is this man who wants to defend and speak for and say to whatever God is there, or the absence that is there in place of God, how dare you? How dare you treat this little Alabama boy? He's defenseless, but I'm not. I'm a superior intelligence. I have stronger will. I have the balls to stand up to you, God, and say, account for yourself. This is unjust. And if you permit this injustice to continue, then you will have me as an enemy. This quarrel with God, to borrow the title of Lawrence Thompson's book, is repeated over and over again. But at the point that that Ahab lets his pursuit of justice, to become absolute, monomaniacal, really, about justice at the cost of the most human of attachments, father and son, parent and child, he loses his humanity and not only dooms himself, but those who are in his charge. And it's not because he has done what is, in Melville's view, the wrong thing. He is by nature a captain, by nature a leader. And that's what men have to do. We have to have that to avoid anarchy. We have to have that obeying of society's rules. Maybe I should stop for a moment here and let you ask some questions, just so I can catch my breath. I'm sorry. Boy, this damn chemo really catch you. Yes. Okay. Thank you, sir. Here's to you. Anybody? How long has it been since you've read Moby Dick, or have you not? Anybody? You're reading it now?
Bought it 15 years ago.
Ah!
2/3 of the way through.
And you've been reading it constantly since.
Yeah. It's a lot. Each chapter is a lot.
You're absolutely right. And that's why it's maybe 45th on this list of best American novels. Well, I can't get over that. Presided over by Meredith Vieira, our guiding spirits. It's because people don't, I read some of the comments. People read it the way they read an adventure story. And they say, well, where's the adventure? And we have, this many pages in which there's no adventure at all, in which what we have is a description of the crew's deportment, what they do, what their jobs are, and finding always analogies that which they do as part of their work corresponds in some way to some truth that lies beyond the mask. Melville writes about Ahab's deportment as captain, and he uses that word. He said, men in authority, rulers, by the nature of their role in society, must use masks. That's the only way they can get men to do their bidding. And that idea of the mask, of course, is central to the book, is crucial. And if you'll give me a second, I'll see if I can find it here. No, I can't see with my glasses, and I can't see without them. That's Melvillian, I guess. Let's see. I've got to find this. I apologize. That's why I don't write my books this way. They never get finished. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Somebody help me. Well, you guys, no, I'm sorry. No, I'm trying to hunt through my, I'm trying to hunt through this, where he speaks of pasteboard masks, that everything is but a pasteboard mask. And what one must do if one is genuine in his role. Melville sort of, to say condemns is wrong, but he dismisses the man who just lives for the day, right? We have in the three, a representation of humanity divided into three parts in the three mates. Starbuck is rationality. And Melville points out, or Ishmael does, that mere rationality renders one incompetent. And Starbuck, despite his superior reasoning, cannot bring himself to do what must be done if the ship is to be saved, which is mutiny, because that offends his understanding of the importance of order. And then we have Stubb, who has just a reckless jollity. He lives for the moment. And then we have Flask, who doesn't give a damn. And to live life that way, it's a lot like living as a native in the South Seas that the Melville protagonist rejects over and over again. That, is, in his understanding, is life without a purpose. And why, although we see that theme is repeated in these novels, of someone who lives in a state of natural bliss, where he can have all the sex he wants, without even signing a contract, getting her permission. That all this is just natural. You do what you want, any moment you do it. That this is not life. That life must be examined. That in a way, Ahab represents the apex, ironically, at the same time as the depths of that intelligence which seeks to know why, to understand. We are driven by the need for understanding. Although, here's Melville again, undercutting what he's just said, if we look for our understanding too deeply, if we stand at the masthead and look down into the sea, seeking to, in our musings about our condition as human beings, what will happen? We will tumble, like Narcissus, into our own image and, ironically, lose our identity. It will catch no whales doing that. And he says it, notes the importance of catching whales, of making money. Remember, money not the root of all evil, he says. Money is necessary for the functioning of society. He doesn't want to go to sea as a tourist where he's paying somebody for the voyage. He wants to be paid because in being paid to be a hand, he has an affirmation of his value, his worth to society. That's the way society shows it. At the same time, if you give yourself entirely to money, to the pursuit of money, you also lose something important about the spiritual side of life and knowing what your relation is to the infinite, whatever that is. Melville is not an atheist. Melville wants desperately, he writes, desperately to believe in God. There must be a God, but he doesn't know how that can be. He wants his reason to give him some means of embracing what he feels inside in this need for faith must be. And he looks and looks and looks, and all his life, in the most sincere way he could, through his writing, doesn't find it. He doesn't give us answers because he has no answer finally, except, and as this he says very specifically, remember I quoted from what Babylanja says in Marty, that ultimately, in the face of our need to, there needs to be a God, but without that proof of it, that evidence of that, we are thrown back on our sense of righteousness and love. And that is all that we can bank upon in our existence, to give existence, and a foundation of meaning, of purpose, of value. So he's a very, very complicated guy. When he writes to his friend Hawthorne, I have written a wicked book, but feel spotless as a lamb. He's not saying I've written a wicked book because I'm, that in my portrait of Ahab, that this is devil worship, which I've actually seen in print, that somehow he is being satanic in the full meaning of that word, in writing about Ahab's fight against God or confrontation with God. It's that the very questioning puts one outside of the realm of faith. Remember, Father Mapple, the moment you have any doubt at all, he says, you have lost your innocence. You can no longer have complete faith. That is what dooms us. It's the same thing that we're told in other of the early books as well. That's the whole point in his pursuit of Yilla, this spiritualized, beautiful woman, blonde woman in the South Seas, who represents a carnality without, desire without carnality, who represents pure virtue, and the protagonist goes on this search throughout the world, for which we have other names of different countries, in search of Yilla. And the philosopher Babbalanja says that once you have lost Yilla, you will never recover her. You cannot recover her, no matter how far you find. So that's very much in Melville's mind, that the minute you step over that line to do what you are impelled to do by that element of God that is within you, because we're made of the same stuff, we're made in his image, so Melville is saying, that the minute we act on that, this is the irony, that we act on that which we are impelled to do, we're damned. Or, what we do is face the fate of Ahab. And that's the conundrum of life itself, that we cannot do one and we cannot do the other. That you can envy the savage who is not concerned about, who never even thinks about his obligations to others or so forth. But in that not thinking, he is not being fully human. And once you start thinking, you are in a state of jeopardy. And all you can do is fall back on maybe this, maybe that, in terms of resources. Okay, again, get to reinforce this about my reading of Ahab, and I'm sorry if that gets boring, but I think it really needs to be underscored. And I certainly have not made a complete list of places that indicate what this attitude is. Let's see, 148. There we go. If I have read this before, blame my short-term memory loss. He says, I'll need my glasses for this. And though of all men, the moody captain of the Pequod was the least given to this sort of shallow assumption of superiority and the rituals of superiority, and though the only homage he ever exacted was implicit, instantaneous obedience, because that's necessary for the ship to function, though he required no man to remove the shoes from his feet ere stepping upon the quarterdeck, and though there were times when, owing to peculiar circumstances connected with events hereafter to be detailed, he addressed them in unusual terms. He's preparing us for what he's going to tell us later on, in which he seduces the crew, knowing their weakness, to do his bidding. He knows that there is that little sliver of rebellion against injustice that he feels overpowering within himself. And so he uses his mask in order to get them to go along. He speaks to that element within them that recognizes injustice and gets them to not only to go along, but to go along with enthusiasm. And then he says at the start of the next chapter, I, Ishmael, was part of that crew. So that even Ishmael, i.e. Melville, understand the seductive power of that rebellion against the circumstances of life itself. Hereafter to be detailed, he addressed them in unusual terms, whether of condescension or in terrorem or otherwise, Yet even Captain Ahab was by no means unobservant of the paramount forms and usages of the sea, nor perhaps will it fail to be eventually perceived that behind those forms and usages of hierarchy, as it were, he sometimes masked himself, incidentally making use of them for other and more private ends than they were legitimately intended to serve. That certain sultanism of his brain, which had otherwise in a good degree remained unmanifested, through those forms, that same sultanism became incarnate in an irresistible dictatorship for be a man's intellectual superiority what it will, it can never assume the practical available supremacy over other men. Despite this, it can never, and here's his mark, here's the Democrat in Melville, Ishmael, speaking. Can never assume the practical available supremacy over other men without the aid of some sort of external author. Unfortunately, society is dependent upon chicane. And this is an idea that he will develop in a book following, 2 novels following, well, 3, if you count, something he wrote for money, a novel called The Confidence Man, in which you have lost all purchase in a fixed reality. Everybody is a con artist, and all you can do, you have no fulcrum. It's like being in an Einsteinian universe where everything is relative and there is no absolute truth. There's nothing you can finally bank on. It's really quite remarkable. But Ahab, my captain, still moves before me in all his Nantucket grimness and shagginess. And in this episode touching emperors and kings, I must not conceal that I have only to do with a poor old whale hunter like him. Poor old whale hunter, but he stands for so much more, as he says right next. And therefore, all outward majistical trappings and housings are denied me. O Ahab, what shall be grand in thee? It must be plucked at from the skies and dived for in the deep and featured in the unbodied air, because it is not in our everyday reality. That this is a superhuman, an ecstatic search that he is going for, which can only be pursued outside of being. Much is made of the phrase when Ahab acknowledges that he is madness maddened. And so this is dismissed that he's sort of a crazy man. That's not quite true. What it's really meant, I would propose by that statement, is that being maddened by the injustice in the world, by the patent unfairness all around him, by the misery, by the death of children of starvation, as that powerful scene in Redburn where he sees this in the shadows, this mother and child slowly dying for lack of food. And the next day there's just some lime thrown where the bodies were. That in all that there is simply an unacceptable condition of life that one must rise against it. The quest for Moby Dick, the whale. Once again, this is often misunderstood. He's just seeking revenge. A whale, as Starbucks says, some poor dumb brute has done this to you with no will at all. It's not that he picked you out to hurt you. He was simply doing what a dumb brute does to defend himself. This is wrong for you to pursue this whale. And Ahab speaks directly to that, in which he says that it's not the whale itself. It's what the whale represents. That it's the nature of creation as ordered by this deity or not ordered by a deity that he revolts against. And in order to express this anger, to strike back at what is insupportable, that he focuses on the symbol of nature, the greatest creation of nature, which is this white whale. And he says specifically this in this wonderful oration that he gives us. Well, maybe I never wrote it down. Anyway, where he says, be the white whale agent or be the white whale principle, that he must strike at it. Be the white whale, the means by which God enters into our world and creates some actions which have unfortunate, horrible consequences. Or be the white whale principle. If we believe in nature itself being God, if nature itself is an expression of some deific order or vision or state, that given his ability to perceive, he is forced to strike back. Strike through the pasteboard mask. Strike through what is apparent. And in this, of course, Melville is affected by Neoplatonism, affected by what was quite popular in the 19th century, about his time, Transcendentalism. What does Transcendentalism mean? That there is something which transcends that which is available to us in our senses. That it's very Neoplatonic. That behind all things that exist, there is an idea, an essence of which that thing or us is the physical manifestation, but is finally only temporary. And that is due to our limited vision that we cannot see beyond that mask, that everything that we see, that everything that we can approach with our senses represents. And that is precisely what Ahab tries to do. Think of the harpoon, the blessing of the harpoon. Ego non baptizo Dei in nomine Dei. I do not baptize you in the name of God, but in the name said in nomine diaboli, but in the name of the devil. It doesn't mean he's a devil worshiper, but he knows that in doing this he has gone beyond the limits that existence itself has placed upon him. That what he does, and Ishmael reflects on this too, sees this, that what he does is by its very nature wicked. What he does upsets order. And yet there is no escaping that compulsion, that inner need, that inner drive to do that. Ahab has an ivory leg, which makes him, in a way, and this is reflected in the books, in words, specific words, when he stumps around on the deck, and later on, again, that in that artificial leg, which is made of the whalebone, the jawbone of a whale. It's interesting that it's chosen the jawbone, as though the whale would speak. What would that part of this body be, but the jaw? Turned into this part of him, which is not a part of him. It is a part of him. It is not a part of him. To return to Stubb's dream, Stubb is told, don't be offended. Don't take it personally. If Ahab in your dream kicks you with his ivory leg, it's not a real leg. It's a living member of the body that gives offense. That's why a slap from a man is more painful than a whipping with a cane, because the cane is not the living member. Well, Ahab, of course, sees nature as a living member of whatever it is that governs the universe, that underlies the universe. And he feels offended. He has been struck by this, this piece of ivory, this whale, and now he is going to answer it in the only way that he thinks he can. All right, again, let me turn to you for any questions, or if I've confused any of you in reporting some of Melville's own ambiguity. Yes, question? Go ahead.
How common was it at the time to have this feeling about protesting against God? Was that?
Oh.
Was anybody doing it? Was he unique?
I mean, there's always been a lot of protest against God, against certain religions. Protest. The 19th century saw a sprouting of all kinds of new religious orders and new ways of living. We were great experimenters in the 19th century with communities. Fruitlands in Massachusetts was one such. The problem with these communities, number one, if they were founded by men, the men sat around and talked philosophy and poetry, and the women did the work. And that didn't work very well. The other, so what's the, anyway, the other thing that was characteristic of them was that if they were founded by men, there was free sex. And if they were founded by women, as was Shakerism, my mother Ann Lee, there was no sex at all. And that was pretty much an isobar that you could draw on this map of these communities. So there was a lot of experimentation. People were very reluctant to say there is no God, but there were certainly anti-theistic movements of great popularity that departed from traditional teachings of Christianity. That was really very common. The history of religion in America is really quite fascinating. It's worth some investigation. A lot of what we see today comes out of the late 18th century and the early 20th century. There was a feeling of great spiritual dearth in this country because our thinkers had emphasized the way to a just, equitable, and fulfilling society through what we did. But then that didn't bring happiness. Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, we got life and liberty, but a lot of people weren't happy. One of the things that marks us as a nation is this cult of happiness. We've all got to be happy. If you look at photographs, same periods, Europe and the United States, in America's early photographs, people smile. In Europe, they don't. It was considered bad form to smile, that you're taking life too lightly. Everybody smiles now. If you're on television, you have to smile. No matter, smile though your heart is breaking, all that. We're a nation of Pagliacci. And maybe that's one of the things that gives us such spiritual hunger, because we haven't paid sufficient attention to the development of our inner selves. We give very little instruction, even in our religious communities. There's relatively little of that. Maybe it's looked upon as an interference in one's private life. I'm shocked sometimes by how little people who consider themselves Christian or Jews. I taught at Union College, which had a rather heavy Jewish population. And I remember teaching a course, and it was Faulkner. And I was dealing with Go Down Moses, and I spoke about Benjamin, this character named Benji in the story. And I said, of course, you see the reference to Benjamin in the Bible. Nobody saw it. You look at faces, you learn to read faces. And I said, I should refer to the story of Joseph. And here was about a third of the class were Jews. And they didn't know the story of Joseph. What the hell are these kids brought up on? You know? I mean, and we've lost that dimension. One of the reasons that Jews have succeeded at surviving through thousands of years of terrible oppression, they're the people of the book, that the book has held them together, that you have people studying the Bible, studying the Torah, you know, scholars, debates, I mean, in certain ways, certain places, I sort of wonder about that. I shouldn't be too free in my words here, although I'm not afraid of anybody. But anyway, but you know, that's what it makes them a people. It's one of the things that we sought with the creation of a national literature. How do we create a sense of Americanness in place of Virginianness and New Jersey-ness and New York? And it was determined by a number of people, a number of writers, that one of the things we had to do was tell stories about ourselves. That if we tell stories about ourselves and made sure that we located these stories in places that people would recognize, that these places would be infused with a familiarity, with a sense of ourness that otherwise did not exist. So, you know, that's been a problem. I don't know if I've answered your question very well, but it's something that has. It is not something new. It was very strong in the 19th century. These tides ebb and wax. Is that right? Wrong pair in society. We may be in for another great awakening. Who knows? Yes. He wrote under the long.
No, Melville was a teacher at one time.
Yes, school teacher. Before he became a writer.
Correct. And while there, you mentioned his association with the Transcendentalist movement. That was also a large region for the abolitionist movement. Could he have intersected with that as well, and might that have influenced his writing thinking?
Well, sure. Abolitionism was a rising tide, although it did not reach overwhelming proportions by the time of Moby Dick. And his opposition to slavery actually, predates. Can't say predates as a movement. After all, it almost prevented us from becoming a country. The three-fifths solution was what saved the notion of a country, and it was a bargain we paid a great price for. But as it happens, the woman he married was the daughter of Lemuel Shaw. Lemuel Shaw was the judge in the first case in which a female slave who had escaped from the South and lived in Massachusetts and was reclaimed was freed. You know the case? Yeah. And through the Sedgwicks. And there's a connection with the Catherine Sedgwick. Well, that's great. She should be better known. Well, the drive for acquainting people with women's literature has done a lot to reestablish, or at least create some interest in some of her novels. A very interesting person. And obviously she had a crush on William Cullen Bryant, who is one of my specialties, whatever you want to call it. So I would say that this abolitionist sentiment. Remember, Melville came from New York, upstate New York. Who were the founders of the Society for Abolition in New York? Hamilton and Burr. Interesting, isn't it? So that it didn't need transcendentalism. Transcendentalism gave it more of a spiritual backing in a sense of the philosophy behind it, the equality of human beings. But it was very strong in sections of the country in the Northeast, and especially in New York.
Around that area of Massachusetts.
Yeah. John?
How about Emerson and Melville? Did they know each other? Or they overlap?
I'm trying to think. Do I know of any occasion in which the two met? And I can't think of a single one. I don't think so. I mean, that's the only answer I can give. Of course, I think you know me well enough to know that I think Emerson's role in the history of American literature is vastly overrated. And I think he's vastly overrated as a writer. He bores me to tears. Lousy writer. Emerson and Poe, very overrated. I can't stand Poe. Anybody else? Go ahead. No, somebody just left. Oh, yes.
I'm still having trouble with your view of this as justice rather than...
As justice rather than
vengeance. In other words,
could you just repeat that? I'm sorry.
So
vengeance.
I'm having trouble squaring your view of Ahab as an agent of justice rather than an agent of revenge. It seems to me that he is acting out at something that was done to him that he views as a bigger injustice.
But it's not localized to that. It is only localized to that whale. It represents something in the setup of the universe. It's not, you did this to me, and so I'm going to get you to the exclusion of everything else. The whale is a symbol to him. It's a little like, I don't know.
He excludes helping the captain of that ship.
I'm sorry.
He excludes helping
Yes.
the captain of the ship.
Yes. And?
And so, I mean, that's why it seems more like vengeance.
Well, as I said, that's the point at which he crosses the line, in which his monomaniacal devotion to justice, to his revolt against the order of the universe, to the way things are set up, crosses the line. Remember, that Melville, over and over again in a number of different particulars, will say that if you become one thing exclusively, if that becomes your God, if that becomes your reason for life, if that becomes your reason for action, exclusively, then you will run afoul of the conditions of life, and you will fail. Somehow that'll bite you in the tail. And that's exactly what happens to Ahab. His vengeance, as it were, his attack, his quarrel, is with that which he addresses. In that soliloquy that I, damn it, can't find, seems to be my hallmark. He doesn't address the whale. He addresses God. Pick on somebody your own size. Though thou launchest full-freighted navies of worlds, I acknowledge your power. You don't have to strike me down to prove that you're stronger than I am. You don't have to you have to do that to make me call you Lord. I acknowledge all that, but meet with me face to face, as it were. Deal with me in terms of the reason of things. Explain to me why things are the way they are. And he's addressing God there, not the whale. He never thinks the whale speaks. The whale becomes the means by which he expresses this anger. I understand your reading because that's the predominant one. But I think if you read the book carefully, and it's a book that it is so packed. It's amazing. This guy wrote this book in a little bit more than a year. I couldn't write it out in longhand in that time. It's remarkable. I stand in that room in Pittsfield where he did it, and I'm simply overcome with my own frailty and incompetence. This is a remarkable thing. And he has no internet handy so he can look up Phaidon or whatever. This is all in his head, and it's remembered from that term he took in Hebrew legend and mythology at Albany Academy, and maybe also subsequent reading he did. the extent of this man's genius, of his intellectual capacities, is enormous. You know, I think that there are two really bright, outstandingly bright American writers. One is William Cullen Bryant, and the other is Melville. And it's by the evidence of what they knew and what they did and how well they did it, you know. And, well, certainly Bryant is not sufficiently recognized. People don't know very much about his life at all. He's probably the most neglected major American figure of the 19th century and one of the most important in my view. But look at Melville. Look, Melville, when Melville died, he was identified as the author of Typee, and he wrote about the South Seas. When Moby Dick was mentioned, they'd get something wrong, but most of it wasn't even mentioned. He was in obscurity. What brought Melville back was that it made some silly movie in Hollywood about Moby Dick, and they changed the story so it's unrecognizable, and I haven't seen the movie, I've only read about it, but I think they introduce a female in it, and Ishmael goes off with the female or some such thing. It's completely unrecognizable. But it brought him back into the room, as it were. And right after that, they discover a copy of Billy Budd, which exists in a number of different fragments. And so at Harvard, they throw them all together. It's actually not a very good job. It has to be redone later. And that starts to increase some interest in him. Somebody writes a biography called Herman Melville, Mariner and Mystic, and that enjoys a modest success. And this thing starts snowballing. And it's also at a time when finally that America has established itself as a significant world power, politically, militarily, that we start to say, hey, not so bad American literature. You know, in the university, American literature was sneered at. So when I went to Duke and they asked me what I wanted to concentrate on, and I said American literature, they sort of said, the easy way. And then when I got my first job, the chairman of the department said, is there an American literature? Said with a phony British accent, of course. It was not respectable. And I was specifically told, oh, you're too intelligent to do American literature. Do something that is up. And this was my passion. It took, even in the early 1960s, that we were still fighting a rearguard action in our, among intellectual circles about America's second-rate culture. In English departments, the people who taught American literature would. In my department, the chairman of the department who hated American literature, he taught American literature. Anytime there was a buck in it, he took it over, not thinking that somebody who specialized in American literature can't be much, so can't do very much. So it's been a slow process of acceptance. I mean, I would say that now American literature, or was until about 10 years ago, had come to be the dominant literature, contemporary, of the world. And people know Great Gatsby and Hemingway and so forth, and to some extent Faulkner, although he's hard to understand for foreigners. That we can be proud of our literature. So anyway, I'm sorry I went off the point that you raised. I'm not excluding the motive of vengeance, but I would not say that it is vengeance against that whale per se. I think what is being clearly expressed over and over again is a rebellion which strikes at the whale because that's all that can be struck. Because this is the majesty, the greatness of the whale is the closest he can get to what God is. Or maybe God doesn't exist. I mean, that possibility is also there, in which case it makes him even more angry. Because, as Melville says, a universe without God makes no sense. But the universe that we have doesn't make sense either. So we need some explanation. I do want to let me just get back to this for one moment. Note, hold it. Note the way the novel ends in the epilogue. It ends with the survival of one man, Ishmael, who's Melville, the way he's writing about his own salvation, call me Ishmael. And he's offering us Ishmael, who at one point does say, Ishmael, was a member of that crew. Yeah, I went along with this. I'm human. I make mistakes. But what Ishmael represents is brotherhood. And his brotherhood with Queequeg, particularly. This is stressed over and over again in ways, most often, that have nothing to do with the adventure story, that have nothing to do with the killing of whales or Moby Dick. But it's obviously a very important element. Queequeg gets sick. The lifebuoy has been lost. A coffin is made for him by the carpenter on board ship. I think in the movie, the John Huston movie, at least I saw this on television not too long ago, and I said, what? That it said that the coffin was made for Ahab. They showed a clip, but maybe it was the wrong movie. That's astounding. Because the point, of course, is not that Ahab is saved. Ahab is not saved. The point is that it is that sign of brotherhood, that the coffin, which was meant for Queequeg, for his dead body to be sent back to where he came from, becomes a life preserver. What we have here is a resurrection. Now, that theme of resurrection and of crucifixion is not just here and there and forgotten. It is persistent in the book. Remember I talked to you last time about the Iron Crown of Lombardy. It's not the only place. When we first have Ahab described to us, what are we told? That he has crucifixion in his face. He's also, as though struck by a lightning bolt, is divided, which shows something of the division within the man himself. But the face itself is tortured as in rictus, as in a crucifixion. And again, we have allusion to the story of Jesus. There is a place where we are, I'm not even going to look for it. There's a place in which we're told that the truest life that was ever lived was that of Jesus of Nazareth. The truest book that was ever written is the Book of Solomon. Wow. Now there's a very great division, isn't there? The truest life is that of Jesus. That's the model. That's what the best life that one can live, the model for our existence. But the best book is the Book of Solomon, and you know the Book of Solomon, right? You know, it's very sensuous poetry. It's sensuous in a way that no precepts of Jesus is. No precept of Jesus preaches that. So the truest book describes this physical yearning, and it describes love, physical love, but also spiritual love. In fact, there's always an attempt to sort of smuggle him under the tent and say, but he's talking about love of God. No, he's not. He's talking about a woman and her breasts and all the rest. But that's no less holy. That's no less valid. That's no less part of our existence than the other. He has a third book in there now, and talks about Rabelais. That slipped my mind now. But, it's these little things that tell you so much about the book. Ahab is doomed, but he has no choice. He knows what he must do, and he knows how it's going to end. There's even a foreshadowing of his end, where he is lashed by the ropes to the whale. But who survives? Ishmael, on the lifebuoy, on that which was designed as an accoutrement of death, becomes, through what it represents, love for each other, not homosexual love, although he's not excluding that, but this is not a plea for, any particular form of love, but for love itself, for love of one another, for recognition of our common humanity, which he's done over and over in this book, when he compares pagan rites, the pagan spiritual to the Christian spiritual, that there's an equivalency in these through the expression of love. I don't mean to hammer that, but I think it really is profound in the book. And I know it takes a reorientation of one's thinking in order to read it that way. That there's so much prior, we are so predisposed to think of Ahab as, as evil, as a villain, and he's not. I mean, when I first read it in 1956, I got the book. And I remember disagreeing with my teacher. And I've read the book at least 50 times since then, because every time I taught everything, I always reread what was on the syllabus. And so every time I taught Moby Dick, I reread Moby Dick. And my admiration, my wonder of the book has, I tell you the truth, has increased every time. And I keep learning new things about the book. It's a life's work. And I don't know if I'll live long enough, but I've thought about sitting down and doing one chapter at a time and writing as full an exegesis of that chapter as I can. Although I'm too lazy, I don't write things down very much. John, you had a hand up? No. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Oh, break! Oh, I'm bad on breaks. See, I get caught in a moment. Sorry. Let's have a break. Yes, by all means. Questions? Yes.
I want to hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. I want to hear what is your opinion about this. Every time that I read this book, right, I stop when Ahab started to talk about and his life, like his wife is always a poor woman and things like that. I stopped there because I am intertwined with Ahab and the world and all the concepts that are way and beyond our nature, his nature, and all of a sudden the book brings me back to earth.
Yes.
To the, the common things.
Yes.
And I do believe that Melville wrote this book with every word, thinking about every word. There is nothing for printed in this book. Then why I'm here and all of a sudden Melville dumped me on the earth? What do you think about that?
Because he wants to emphasize that Ahab is a man like me in this room. He's a human being like you. And he is not immune to the pleasures of the flesh. Again, talks about Book of Solomon. It's emphasized not only that he has a wife, but he has a young wife. But his passion, his obsession, this matter of injustice has taken over his whole life. It's become the center of his being. And he's junked everything else. He has turned his back on, Melville is not saying do this. Quite the contrary. He's describing a character who has no alternative. If there is a person to pay heed to as a model, it's Ishmael. Maybe even Starbuck. Although Starbuck is too much a creature of who is given to reason and then feels guilty about his shortcomings in that regard. I hesitate, I was just speaking with someone here, I hesitate to recommend Pierre, which is the next book he published. It's a novel. It's not well written. It's as far a fall from excellence in writing, as Moby Dick is a towering success. But it's the same problem. I can describe it very briefly. Its subtitle is The Ambiguities. Pierre or the ambiguities. So we're back to that theme of ambiguity. Pierre is a young man very much like Herman Melville, and his life is charted out for him. His mother has practically picked out his wife. She is sort of approved by the class, by his class. She's perfect in almost every regard. And he's ready to live that kind of life that people of his status can expect. And then he notices that there's a portrait. There's a portrait of a girl, a milkmaid, I believe she is, as I recall. And she looks the picture of his father. And he decides that this girl is really his sister, that this is his father's bastard child. How can he go on in life enjoying the fruits of his father's profession, his wealth and all the rest, while this poor child, this orphan, once again we have that, is treated the way she is. And so he dumps his fiancée and he takes on this young woman. Not so much out of love, as we normally might think of it in a romantic novel, but out of a sense of obligation to her, to make things right. That as best he can, he wants to be the agent of something that is close to justice. Okay? It winds up ruining his life. It winds up ruining everybody's life. Turns out at the end that he made the wrong choice, that the information he had was flawed, that it wasn't true. And meanwhile, we have this sort of stack of bodies at the end, all as a consequence of this wrong, proper moral choice, at least that we would all applaud, that he had made. And there's lots of indications of this. He's in New York City, as Melville was, and he's looking for Plinlimmon's pamphlet. Plinlimmon's pamphlet is a philosophical guide to how to live life. The answers are all there. And he's looking for it, and he can't find it. And yet it's slipped through a hole in his pocket, or a slit in his pocket, and all the time he's carrying it around in this coat that he wears. It's the concept of the ambiguities follows very much in line with what I've been describing, about Moby Dick. It's about the inability ever to see to the bottom of a choice you make. And we always become susceptible to the disaster that issues from that choice. It's not well written. It's Pierre, not Moby Dick, that sank his boat as an author. It was a disaster, and it was recognized as a disaster. And yet there's something very intriguing about the book that has attracted admirers. About 5 years ago, some French filmmaker turned it into a film. And he was obsessive about it. It's a project that he tried to work on for years. He even wrote to me for help in interpreting something. And I think he made the film, and I think it got bad reviews. I'd hate to make that film. I don't know what I would do with it. But it indicates where he's going. I don't know how many of you have read Billy Budd, but I advise it, because we're dealing with the same thing. Here is someone, and this kind of situation and this kind of character recurs in Melville, where, and you get it in the town host story in this novel, where Radney hates Steelkilt, or is it Steelkilt who hates Radney? Anyways, there's very bad blood between the two, and it causes a mutiny. Well, in Billy Budd, we have a character who can't stand Billy Budd, who, as his name suggests, is pure, innocent, all goodness. And somehow this infuriates, what is his name? Come on. Again, I'm drawing a blank. Oh, I know it as well as my own. This morning I couldn't remember my cousin's first name. God, this is awful. At any rate, Any rate, what happens is that he insults Billy. And Billy, who has his one physical infirmity, his one imperfection, is that he stutters when he gets excited. And he knows he cannot respond to this charge, of which he is innocent, using his voice, using words. And so he lashes out and he punches this fellow, who falls backward, and his head hits a metal plate on the deck, and he dies as a result. Only recently in the Navy there has been an insurrection. This is in fact, this was actually historically true. And so the only way to the captain cannot excuse Billy, and he loves Billy. Billy is his favorite in the crew. But he knows he cannot let him off the hook, cannot show favoritism. The rules, the law, says that Billy must be hanged. And so Billy is hanged. And when he's hanged, to show his innocence, it has no erection. And as you know, hanging produces an erection in males. Well, it couldn't produce an erection in females, I guess. Anyway. But Billy's last words, as he's about to be swung from the rope, is, "God bless Captain Veer." Now, the name of the captain is significant. Veer, truth. And Billy saying, "God bless Captain Veer," acknowledges the rightness of his decision. If we're going to live in society, we have to have laws. And if someone dies, and according to the books, the way in which things are written down, using language and so forth, that's the end that he has to suffer. And so he dies. And he is another one of these Christ figures. Melville is, I wouldn't say obsessed, that's too strong a word. But he is really attached to the story of Jesus. The idea of God made man who sacrifices, who sacrifices his life to atone for our sins, is very strong in him. He was raised in a Dutch Reformed church, was exposed to Presbyterian teaching, but that doesn't mean that he was a narrow sectarian. He wasn't. But his belief in the Christian tradition was abiding, and he kept trying to somehow to make sense of it. But his heart, his instincts, his feelings were very much in that direction. Yes?
Well,
I didn't repeat your question earlier. I apologize.
it doesn't matter. I mean, it's but in my crazy mind, yeah. Sometimes what I think when I stop there and I think, this human, and he talks about his wife, then I don't know why I'm feeling like it's the moment when Jesus Christ goes to meditation, prayers before he's going to be crucified, before he's cut, and he'd say, "Forgive me, Father," and I don't know, I don't even remember anymore than my own religion, yeah. And he said, "Forgive me," and
in the Garden of Gethsemane?
Yeah, yes. I mean, that thing of Melville talking, Habad talking about his wife and the goodness of his wife, bring me straight to that.
Well, Jesus, did not advocate celibacy, preach against sex. We have St. Paul to thank for all that.
Yeah.
You know.
But I don't know why I connect those moments. I mean, it's
Well, I can only give you the same answer I gave you before, and which is that the two are not divided. They're not contradictory. And he does want to emphasize the humanity of Ahab. And remember, this is what starts him off in writing the novel Typee, even though it's advertised as a novel about what you do in the uncertainty of not knowing whether this tribe or these people are cannibals or not. That's not really the issue in Typee. What really, and in Melville's own life, the issue was that suddenly this fellow who's brought up properly in a Christian home and all that is off, in the South Seas, and all these sweet-looking girls are available to him. And, and it's like shaking hands, maybe even less of a problem than that. That must have been a shock to the young man. And he saw nothing wrong with it, in terms of the behavior of these people. So, well, what is the true religion here? How am I supposed to behave? What is wrong with sexuality, Well, because his society teaches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that society is a very intricate machine. And you don't just, it's not a buffet where you pick what you like. That when you buy into the whole thing in some way. That you have to make your peace with the foundations of that society. That's why, this novel that came out, 2 years ago, about trying to explain for this lapse of time, why Melville did not finish Moby Dick as he said he would by December of 1850. And the answer, no evidence of this at all, is that he was shacking up with the lady down the road. Well, I don't believe it. Not because I would condemn him for, I don't know what his relationship with his wife was. It turned out to be pretty bad, because he was not a happy man. And people in his family, in Elizabeth Shaw's family, his wife's family, referred to him as the monster. And for a while, they were dropping Moby Dick out of college courses and substituting Kate Chopin's The Awakening, because he was being tagged as a wife beater. Well, we don't have any evidence of that, at least that I know of. But, that the relationship between them was bad, understandably. He was a man of his talents, of his knowledge, of his passions, and he's gotten nowhere. He's a great writer, and he can't even sell stories to a magazine anymore. And he's working in a custom house in New York City in a drab bureaucratic post. And that's the way he spends the rest of his life, but he still writes. His father-in-law pays for publication of this long poem called Clarel. But you can't go to that well very often. He can't support himself as a writer. He has to support himself as a lowly clerk. That must have been galling. And produced all kinds of pressures. I don't know that he ever turned to drink or anything, but I could see why he might have been short-tempered and called a monster by relatives of his wife. Does that mean he beat her? I don't know. Maybe he did, but we don't know that. There's no piece of paper in which it says, my husband beat me, or Lizzie told me that she beat me. I haven't encountered it. And I've often wondered, how would I feel about him if it turned out to be true? Well, I tried to say, okay, he was a writer. I have to divorce that from his private life. But it's hard to do. I love the man. I love his mind. It's a book that defines your life in a way, if you read it carefully and understand. It's not just the ideas. You can set the ideas down in a philosophical essay. It's his command of language. He's a poet. At the time that he wrote this book, there was no American literary style that he could look to for guidance. This is something of his own compounding out of his reading of Milton and Sir Thomas Browne. He read voraciously. You have different characters who speak differently. It's a very subtle thing. And while he's writing furiously. John.
If you have a second, could you tell us how would he live his life in terms of like a day, or would he work and then come home and then write it?
Yes.
6 to 9 or what?
Yes.
Yeah.
He would come home and write. And he had a son who committed suicide. I mean, it's just terrible. We don't know why. Miserable. Life was tough. He lost literary friends.
Why is that?
They died. Hawthorne got a counselor post in Liverpool. He went over to visit Hawthorne, but the friendship sort of frayed. Now, some scholars have said, well, it was because Melville's homosexual interests didn't suit Hawthorne. There's absolutely no indication of that. I mean, I think what happened was that Melville was so ravenous for a fellow writer who understood the kind of writing he was doing. As you probably know, Melville wrote a review of Mosses from an Old Manse. And when he found out that this guy lived down the road, he went down to see him, And maybe he was, he lived with Hawthorne for a couple of weeks, the man who came to dinner. But it was just, how grateful he was that there was someone who understood what he was trying to do. In fact, I think they're very different writers. I mean, I think Hawthorne of the Tales is a wonderful writer. I think as a novelist, he's terrible. And I think, Scarlet Letter is overrated. But as a writer of those tales are wonderful. And one of the things that's so appealing about them is their ambiguities, their ambivalences, and how Hawthorne works them. I think Hawthorne was responding to that. But even that said, they're different writers. And then Hawthorne went on to very popular success. Not only was Scarlet Letter instantly a classic, but then House of the Seven Gables did very well. Of course, Hawthorne had troubles. He did not want to go back to writing tales. I'm probably telling you things you know, but he did not want to go back to writing tales, but the novel form really buffaloed him. And he left a number of novel projects only half written or a third written, and he just couldn't seem to get out of the mire. So, I don't know. We don't know. We have Melville's letters to Hawthorne. We don't have Hawthorne's letters to Melville. And that's a great loss. Who knows what happened to him. For that matter, we have no manuscript of Moby Dick. And that's a problem. I think I mentioned this. Did I? Maybe I didn't want to get into the weeds too much. But, when Melville wanted to have Moby Dick, or The Whale as he called it, he wanted to use its subtitle for the British edition of the book. He wanted it to have a British copyright because that was a stronger copyright than the American copyright. But before that, he'd already paid to have the book set up in plates. So which is the first edition? The first one to be sold in public? That's the British edition. But preceding that by several months is the American edition. The two don't match. Not egregiously, but there are paragraphs that are different. There are sentences that are different. As I think I mentioned to you last time, chapter 25 in the American edition was left out of the British edition completely. The extracts, were put at the end of the book, not the beginning, which is what Melville clearly wanted. There are all sorts of discrepancies, also different spellings and so forth. Now, if we had a manuscript, we could go to the manuscript, but we don't. You will almost without exception now see Moby Dick referred to as Moby-Dick. And the reason for that is the American edition has Moby-Dick. But Melville didn't set that up. That's a typesetter who did that. And nowhere in the book is the whale called Moby-Dick. And yet this narrow-minded, mentality of the critical school that came, scholarly critical school that came to the fore in the late 60s, there's almost a mania for first edition, then you follow the practices in there and so forth. And so now everybody used, so that if not Moby-Dick, it's not authoritative. I think that's nonsense. I think we should just call it Moby Dick without the hyphen, which is what Melville intended. I mean, it's clear. If he wanted to hyphenate it, why didn't he hyphenate it in the book? He didn't. And as far as we know, he had nothing to do with that title page in the original. So, there are problems with the Melville scholarship. And it's a booming industry. We still have produced lots of books. But frankly, I've stopped reading it because I can't stand this stuff anymore. For one thing, people who are literary critics, at least in my field, they don't seem to know how to write. I want to take them in freshman English and go, it's awful. They rely on jargon. I never wanted to write anything that an intelligent reader who didn't have a PhD in English, couldn't read and understand, And there's certain words that kind of spook me, like the word genre. Sometimes I have no choice, but it sort of bothers me. It's a jargon word. And we should be talking to intelligent people, not to each other, if we talk to each other. These books are written for libraries. That's all. And then they soak the libraries, they charge them outrageous prices, and it sits on a shelf, and nobody reads it. I can't tell you how often I go to the Baker Library, to the Dartmouth Library, to read a book that has come out and it's gotten good reviews, and I'm interested in knowing what has been said, and I'm the first one to take it out, even though the book's been out for a year. What are these people reading when they're teaching? They don't keep up. If it's not in their narrow province, they don't have time for it because they've got to produce the next nonsensical article, which is going to be published in a journal that nobody reads. Meanwhile, who's being cheated? They're students, because the teachers don't have the breadth. I can't tell you how, the reading of Italian comedy in the 16th century has enriched my understanding of American backwoods humor published in the 1820s and 30s, the similarities and so forth. Everything you read enriches everything else you read. It expands your mind. But we're producing insurance agents who know only what's in their policies. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not. And it's wrong. I mean, we're in a building now of Dartmouth College, I shouldn't say this, which has a multi-billion-dollar drive on. Everything they're saying that this drive is for, to my mind, hurts undergraduate education. And that's where the problem lies. We're denaturing undergraduate education and liberal arts education, which was once seen as the glory of American higher education. But we reward those administrators who raise a lot of money, but their own scholarship, their own intellectual life is very constricted. More and more people who run colleges have never met a classroom. Some of them, I think, have never read a book. I'm not joking. And yet they're making policies in an educational institution. And the means by which we can have a discussion don't exist. If you object to something that's going on and you have reasons for it, you don't get anywhere. You're treated like a jerk or some crazy eccentric to be laughed at. Look at your alumni magazines. Does anybody ever say a bad word about anything? The news of new reforms. They're going to solve all kinds of problems. Do they ever say why the old ones failed? There's no such thing as failure. It was like living in communist China. It really is. It's the same dynamics of power. The people who control the machine, right? They want you to think that they're doing a great job. So when they report to the trustees, who are off making billions in hedge funds and not reading Moby Dick, I assure you of that, and they say, oh, things are going swimmingly. I just raised $500 million. Well, gee, you're a great guy. Who's understanding the nature of what's going on in this world? And I don't see anybody. It's not that I disagree with these people. It's that there's no forum in which we can talk things out, in which we can debate. Isn't that the basis of a democratic society? Yeah, if I were some damn fool, I can understand. I don't think I'm a damn fool. If I am, point it out. But, riding that hobby horse. Let's get back to Melville. Anybody have a question? I'm keeping you again past the time. I'm supposed to leave. Yes, go ahead.
Not so much a question, just that I thought, I mean, I read a couple of wonderful, great, fantastic, but I thought it was really, but main smart, the funny bit, like the chowder.
Bye.
The scene at the end with the chowder.
Oh, the chowder, yeah.
I mean, some of it's funny, and like that's, you can tell somebody a really heavy story and start with some funny bit.
So it has to do with Melville's writing of humor. He could write very, very funny scenes. There's a very funny scene in, I think it's in White Jacket, of an operation that goes wrong. It's a morbid subject, but it's hilarious. There is one of the areas in which American literature finds its American voice is in the field of humor. And that starts to happen in the 1820s. Perhaps the most popular fictional magazine is called Sporting Times, Sports of the Times, something like that. It's Southwest humor. Of course, in those days, Southwest was Alabama, Georgia, that area. It was published out of New York. It was subscribed to all over the country. Maine humor was very popular. Even William Cullen Bryant, who people don't think of as being a very funny guy, writes humor. James Kirk Paulding, who's a neglected writer and very active in that, writing Native American stuff. He's one of our humor writers. So it's a tradition. It's not that Hemingway says all American literature begins with Mark Twain in one book at Vengeance. Well, Ernest Hemingway didn't read very much American literature. I don't know if he read very much at all. And they keep citing him as though he's some kind of authority. Whatever you think of Huckleberry Finn, and I think it's an enjoyable book, wonderful book, but it certainly does not start American literature, nor is it the first to write American English, nor is it the first to treat some of the kinds of incidents that are detailed in that book. I mean, Mark Twain does a wonderful job. I'm not taking anything away from the book. But to say that this is the start of American literature? Wow! And the other thing, I may have mentioned this to you before, is because American studies and the study of American literature was really developed in the Northeast and particularly in Cambridge, that we get this overemphasis on Emerson, that American literature starts in the 1840s. Well, it really doesn't. What's been going on in New York for over 20 years is of far greater significance. There is a literary culture in New York that starts in the 18 teens, which becomes a hotbed or a place for a nest for American writers. And you can see their influence. But that's not what most people who teach in my field will say before their classes. There's a guy named Donald Pease had a thing on MOOC, called American Renaissance X. And he talks about Emerson and American literature starting in the 1840s. It just ain't true. I mean, he's citing what is orthodoxy. It's not that he's making something up, but it's just not the case. And so why isn't this being challenged? Where are the thinkers, the scholars who say, hey, wait a minute, no. And then if somebody wants to say, oh, but you're not taking this into account, that's fine. Then we have a vital debate. But what's happening to the American college is it's become a morgue. Nobody talks about anything about their fields because they don't want to expose themselves. There was a while back, I started looking at college catalogs, and they all say, we don't teach you what to think, we teach you how to think. I was in the profession for 33 years, 33 years. I never attended a single meeting, a single coffee discussion, a single faculty meeting where anyone ever talked about teaching students how to think or questioning how to teach students how to think. Never, not once. In fact, if you asked that question, you were looked upon as a troublemaker. You know, that's not right. That's not vibrancy in the profession. And what we need to do is to restore some vibrancy to intellectual life in the academy. And it's not happening. And it's not that I'm pushing for my view against somebody else's. I'd like to see some discussion, intelligent discussion, debate, vitality, controversy, new discoveries, new theories. They don't get a chance to breathe. Instead, we get this nonsense that we got from Belgium and from France, deconstruction. There's a wonderful article about how this stuff took America by storm as a result of a weekend in Baltimore. If you write to me, incidentally, you can all feel free to write to me. It's my name, Frank Gado, one word, no caps, at Gmail. It's easy to remember, G for Gado, mail.com. And I'll look for it, and I'll send you the it's true. It's exactly what happened. You know, all these pompous frauds took over, and it just swept right through the academy. And people stopped reading books and started reading theory. I'm going on too long. I'm sorry. I apologize. Right. Hey, listen, once again, really, I so appreciate your coming. You know, if you're going to teach, you've got to have people to teach to, or at least show. So I'm thankful for your presence, your questions. Feel free at any time to ask me questions. I've given you my email address, very easy to remember. My name is easy to spell, 4 letters, G-A-D-O, mispronounced 6 different ways. It's not Gado, it's Gado. My background is Piedmontese, and I'm trying to write an autobiography, and I hope to finish it. And you've been wonderful. Thank you, and you've put up with me. Thank you. I talk too much. Bless you.